So this is my BMW R1200 GS, and this is my review on the Tractionator Adventure tyres that I've got on the bike, and had them on for about a little over 1,000 kilometres now. This bike I use principally for getting around the country, for touring, and also a fair bit of off-road work. As you can see, most of it's been sorted out so that I can drop it. It's obviously increased in weight a bit over the last couple of years since I've been doing it up, but by and large it's been a great bike for serving me well off-road, but also doing lots of touring on it. The only real changes I've made to it, if you look under here, you will see the Olin's Mechatronic suspension that I used to replace the old stuff that had finally worn out. It's the front, and also the rear end here. I'll show you another video of that later on. Vast improvement of the old suspension that was on there, and also it's been replaced with the Adventure suspension. So the bike sits about 20 mils to an inch higher than it used to because the Adventure suspension is taller than the standard GS. So of course it works really well for what I use it for. But the whole purpose of this video is to look at the tyres. In my video a wee while ago, I talked about how I had replaced the old Anarchy Wilds, these ones here. They weren't that old, but the reason I replaced them was because the noise out of these tyres on the road was just too much for the amount of road driving I had to do to get to where I was going to be riding. So I decided as an experiment to replace it with these, the Tractionator Adventure tyres from Motoz, and they're relatively new on the market in comparison to other tyres, and they've received lots of different opinions from people on the internet. I need to say from the beginning they are much quieter than the Anarchy Wilds that I'd taken off, which was actually the point. The question of course is, how well do they handle for the sort of riding that I'm tending to do? And I have to say from the outset they actually handle really well. They're much better than I sort of expected, given the fact that some people complained particularly about the front tyre. But I found on this particular bike, given its weight, the tyre actually handles all the conditions I put it through really well, whether it be tar seal, wet or dry, whether it be roads that are uneven, tar snakes that you might come across, shoving yourself over different layers of tarmac or concrete, and also when you're hitting those little glowy bumps in the middle of the road, they certainly ride over those without any ease. The highlights of this tyre is that it's different from the Anarchy Wild in a number of ways. Firstly, you notice these voids that are in the middle here, which give you a reasonable amount of traction, particularly on the rear tyre for paddling the bike forward. But on the front tyre, it's these voids across the board that I think make the tyre so noisy. Whereas you notice on the Tractionator, there's the major central knob here, and it runs consistently through the tyre, which means that the silence on the straight line sections is significantly quieter, but also there's no void straight across the tyre. There is actually a knob that's offset in between, and I think that means that your contact patch remains in contact most of the time. Now it would be completely wrong to suggest that these aren't noisy at all. They do rumble a little bit, but they don't hit that horrible high-pitched scream that I found that the Wilds managed to do. That being the case, the question is, how do they handle off-road? And I've had these off-road, and I have to say, I reckon this front tyre is actually better for general purpose than the Anarchy Wild. Now, some people will disagree with that, depending on how aggressively you ride, but you know, I ride reasonably well off-road, and the Tractionator Adventure has been a really good tyre. You notice that on this one here, certainly got knobs that hang off to the side, but they are quite round by comparison to these ones here, which are actually a little bit more proud and sharper on the edge, which means that they handle really well both in rocky, gravel or even muddy conditions, and the tyre actually does clean out pretty well. So from the front point of view, I actually think they're a really good tyre. They are also a 4-ply construction, so the Wild over here is a radial. This is a 4-ply cross-ply arrangement, so there's no, it's a different construction. But these have 4 plies in them, which means that the tyre is actually quite a lot heavier than the Anarchy Wild. And what that's tended to mean is that I found that, I think this is the reason why, being a weightier tyre, it actually adds a bit of gyroscopic force on the bike, which means that when you're hitting into corners, it doesn't drop into the corner quite as badly as the Wild did. I found with the Wild tyre that when you were going into a corner and it got tighter and tighter, the bike would just fall further and further in, and you were fighting a little bit to keep the thing upright and to pull it out. Whereas on the Tractionator, it actually feels much more neutral in the corners, without feeling like it's wanting to dive in on you all the time. That was just my experience on this particular bike. Other people have a different experience. So very good in that regard. The Tractionator Adventure front tyre and also rear, when they first came out, had some cracking issues that went on around the casing in between here. That was resolved, I believe, in their second attempt, once they kind of got their head around how it was going to work, and this tyre hasn't had any of those sorts of issues, and the front has been actually very good. I've run it pretty much down to the edges. There's still a few knobs left on there, and so far the wear has actually been pretty reasonable. I've never found that it steps out in corners. Yes, it does creep around a little bit on the straight sections of tar seal road if there's a bit of movement in the front, but it's no worse than any other tyre I've ever had, and it's just the nature of knobblies. Once you get used to it, you trust them emphatically, and we've found that actually when they go into corners, they hold really well. So the front tyre, I have to say, is better than the reviews I've had on it. Some have claimed that it's not really good at high speed, and that may well be the case. I never ride much over about 80 miles an hour, and that would only be in certain circumstances. We're pretty tough on road rules here in New Zealand, and I found this tyre to be more than adequate for what I put it through, particularly on a bike like this. If you're really wanting to ride at higher speeds in other parts of the world, then there might be better tyres to do that, possibly your TKC80s. But again, the TKC80 comes with its own set of issues, and one of them is wear. But as a front tyre, the Tractionator Adventure has actually been pretty good, so highly recommend it for this kind of bike, and I know that other people I've met who've used them before have been pretty happy with it as well. And it's the wear factor that's the big issue, and you'll notice that they've got pretty sizable knobs on these, which is where part of the wear comes from. On the rear tyre is about 15 mils of tread as opposed to 10, which is you would normally get in a tyre, and it's that, I think, that gives them that extra lifespan, and the fact that they're made of, well, they tell us it's made of natural rubber, but I suspect there's some silica content in there as well, because they handle okay in the wet weather too. You get back down to here, just got to find a place where I can show you the tyre. These things really are pretty knobbly. They have got big chunks, and when it comes to forward motion on these things, they really do paddle through the gravel and the mud without any problems. They're very open, they don't get clogged up, they clear out pretty well, and the design of the tyre is actually pretty good. Once again, as with the front, they handle really well. I've never had any problems with it on corners, and it's certainly not a super loud tyre. These big knobs here mean you've got quite serious contact patch on the road, which means that it doesn't step away very much. The sidewalls are actually really tough, as with the front. I think it's just an all-round really good tyre, and the longevity of it, I suspect, will be longer than any other knobbly of its type without actually being really hard. Is it comparable to the K60 Scout? No, this handles better. It's a softer compound, it's not as unpredictable in the wet by any stretch of the imagination, it's not as hard, and I think it's actually a better tyre, particularly for that dual purpose that we put them through. One of the queries that people had is this chunking. You'll notice here that you can see it a little bit, that there's bits of rubber that are coming off the, what looks to be the trailing edge, not saying a little bit off the front. Well, that happened in the first 50 kilometres, and it's done it across the tyre, and then it stopped, and it was just a little part that came off to about 3 millimetres possibly, and that seems to have been a common complaint. However, I have to say that even though that was the case, it's never at any point given an issue. There's been absolutely no cracking on the tyre whatsoever. It's largely been pretty reliable across the board. So that's just about 1200 kilometres of wear on this tyre, and in reality it's hardly touched it. So yeah, really good tyre as far as I'm concerned, but it was the chunking that left me a little bit concerned initially, this bit here, but that stopped, and the wear will just catch up with that chunking off that leading edge. I think it was something to do with the fact that when they came out of the molds, there's so much rubber in these things that the cooling rate tended to be a little higher than the rest of the tyre, and just meant that you ended up with some little hairline fractures in the surface. But apart from that, it's not given me any concern at all. So once again, really good tyres. Coming back to the front again, the issue that people have wanted to know about is what pressure do you put on these things, and that's been a really good question, because the handling of the tyre was limited, or linked I think largely to how much pressure you had in them. What I found on this bike is that if I've got 29 to 30 pounds in the front and 34 in the back, which is a pound more than it says on the side of the tyre, then actually it seems to handle pretty well, and I've not had any issues, and I use it off-road at those pressures as well. If you're doing serious off-roading over a longer distance, certainly you could drop them down, I'd say easily to 20 pounds, if not 15, because the sidewalls on these are so heavy, you just have trouble getting a pinch flat or doing any damage. So in softer conditions, yeah, certainly you could deflate them, but I just haven't bothered, and have found the bike handles really well. So high pressures, no, because on the rear tyre it actually says it's a maximum pressure of 34 for its weight loading, but again, all that's kind of complicated. I think people have to experiment a bit with the pressures on the tyres, especially when they're new, and there's not a lot of these being used by people that I know, so trying to get a common sense of how much pressure should be in there is a bit tricky. So for me, I'm running at 29-30 on the front, 34 on the back, 33-34, and that seems to have been the sweet spot for me, and then lower of course for off-road, but certainly no higher than that. And when I've lowered the pressures down the road, I haven't found that the front is quite as secure as I quite like, but that 29-30 pounds seems to be about right for on-road with the knobblies, principally because of the weight and the stiffness of the carcass itself. So that's my review of the Tractionator. Hope that helps. I've had a really good run with them, very pleased with them, and of course the price wise they're about $100 cheaper per tyre in New Zealand than any of the other brands that I've come across, and so far as I'm concerned they've performed as well as the other tyres that I could have got. Anarchy Wilds are a good tyre, very good tyre actually. The only reason I took them off is the noise that they made. Other people will have different experience, but for me that was an issue. So Tractionators made by Motoz, the Adventure models, certainly worth having a look at, and also being aware that I believe there's a Tractionator Adventure 2 model for the front now that has a narrower centre knob here. It's about half the distance, and also they've changed the compound of the tyres so it's a little softer and stickier, with about half the life, and I've heard that a number of people have shifted over to those because they just wanted a little extra handling from the front in certain conditions. Not an issue for me, but being aware that it is available for those who would like to know more about them. Anyway, there you go, simple review of the Tractionator Adventure by Motoz on a BMW R1200.